First test. Yes, the microphone works. Um, Let me welcome you all. We will again encourage, though several of you have said you have reasons to hang in the periphery, um, identifying with the third world, the global south, hanging in the periphery. Um, Here we try to welcome all to the table. So you're welcome, even to come and go, spend part of your time at the table, part of your time in the periphery. I will just open by reminding John Tutino, it's my great pleasure and privilege to teach the history of Mexico at Georgetown and to coordinate this set of programs that come out from the Americas Forum, which allows me to periodically draw groups such as this together and have open, engaging conversations. And this is the last of a three-part, maybe 3.5-part series where we've been looking at the challenges that come with the fact that every 12 years, Mexico and the United States do sequential elections, and binational issues get to matter when you're having first an election in Mexico and then an election in the United States. And how will one put it politely? They should probably matter more explicitly in the United States. They shall get constructed in, I guess I'll politely say, constructed ways. But the issues have mattered, and we come to our final session focused on migrants, migrations, and border challenges. The way we're going to operate is that we have three different yet equally distinguished guests. They're each going to present what they find important for 40-ish minutes. We will then turn to 15 or so minutes of conversation, which we welcome everyone to join in. And then we will take a 5-minute break at the end of each part to grab some coffee, etc., and potentially hit the restrooms, which are around. Keep taking rights, and you can find the restrooms here. I'll mention that now. And we will move forward. So, to begin, I want to welcome Ana Raquel Miñan. Originally from Mexico, she did her undergraduate work at the University of Chicago, where I discovered now she worked with the distinguished historian of migration, May Nye, moved on to Yale, where she worked with an array of folks. She, in 2018, published Undocumented Lives, The Untold Story of Mexican Migration, which I will say caught my attention because she shares interests that I do, which is I want to see it from the level of life in the communities on the ground. And I will recommend Undocumented Lives as an amazing analysis of late 20th century, even into the 21st, if I'm recalling correctly, migration from the perspective of lives on the ground. And literally, I believe 4 days ago, her new book called In the Shadow of Liberty, The Invisible History of Immigrant Detention in the United States, was published with Viking. And I have been promised that by the time of our reception, the Georgetown bookstore will have copies to sell and to ask Anna to sign. I don't know if it's cynical or not. We wait for the reception to make you pay attention to the whole panel. We don't want you sitting here reading the new book and going, wow, throughout. So I will begin by opening the floor, handing the mic, if you will, to Ana Miñan.
Hi. Oh, there you go. Who could sway is there any way to take this off so that they could see the whole thing? No? Okay. It doesn't matter. Who could sway the outcome of the US election? Mexico's president. And then, although you can barely see, it says, immigration is a key issue for voters in the US election, giving Mexico immense power to potentially shape the vote. So read the front page of the online version of the New York Times on March 26th. In other words, less than 4 weeks ago. The article went on to say that the Biden administration needed the Mexican government to stop the flow of non-Mexican migrants through Mexico so that they never even reached the US-Mexico border. But when we look at this, we must ask, how is it that Mexico came to have so much power on US elections? In other words, on US sovereignty. Most Americans focus on US government control when it comes to stopping migration. But as I will argue today, the Mexican government has long played a key role in US enforcement matters. Let me illustrate with the experiences of Alejandra Ramirez. When I conducted an oral history interview with Alejandra, she said that when she was trying to come to the United States, she hired a group of coyotes, human smugglers. And she recalls that the journey was absolutely horrifying. She said, they crossed about 7 people and they made us walk for 3 days. At one point, the migrants reached a river that they had to cross, and the current was so strong that it dragged one of them away. After the group found the man, they continued walking, but their trek was cut short only 2 hours later when they were caught and apprehended by immigration officials. Now, when hearing Alejandra's story, it would be normal to assume that her experiences took place in the US-Mexico border. We see many of those features. She hired coyotes. She traversed through unknown territory. She waded a river, and she was caught and then deported back to her home country. But in fact, Ramirez's story took place in the state of Veracruz in Mexico, 330 miles away from the US-Mexico border. The immigration officials who caught and apprehended her belonged to Mexico's migratory services. Ramirez's experience is not new. It derives from a set of negotiations between Mexico and the United States that goes all the way back to the 1980s. During those years, Central Americans started to leave their home countries because of the civil wars that were occurring there. US officials became particularly worried about this growing flow of migrants and came up with a new idea. Why not create Mexico into a buffer zone to interdict the number of Central Americans that were coming through? As a result, since then, Central American transmigrants have come to experience many of the features that we now traditionally associate with the US-Mexico border throughout all of Mexico. In my talk today, I focus on how and why Mexico took on the job of obstructing Guatemalan, is what I focus on, transmigration for the United States, and show the high costs of these actions on Mexico, the United States, and of course, on transmigrants themselves. I make these claims by drawing on a diverse body of sources that have up to now been unexplored. They include government archives from both Mexico and the United States, migrant correspondence, unpublished ephemera, and personal collections. In addition, I conducted over 100 oral history interviews with Guatemalan migrants. The use of such diverse sources is representative of my broader work. They allow me to provide both a political and a legal history of migration, while at the same time revealing migrants' intimate experiences, actions, and resistance. My first book, which Professor Tutino was just talking about, Undocumented Lives, The Untold Story of Mexican Migration, explores how Mexican migration, unauthorized Mexican migration, became an entrenched phenomenon. It argues that during the 1970s, the Mexican government came to see with favor the departure of its own citizens to the United States. At the same time, US policymakers came to implement much more draconian policies against these very migrants. In response, Mexican migrants created what I call their own cartographies of belonging, which allowed them to become central participants and to shape the cultural, social, and legal life of both countries. Just to give you an example, in the 1970s, Mexican migrants started to create hometown associations. Groups of organized people started to send money, not just to their family members, but to their whole communities. And they became so indispensable in Mexico that they came on to take the role of the Mexican state, creating a type of extraterritorial welfare state in Mexico. And as a result, they took much of the political power away from the government. Their actions also helped to change US culture because they were so prominent. So if this is how the Mexican government was acting towards Mexicans, how did this affect Guatemalan migration? How did this affect how they acted towards Guatemalans and how it was that Mexico came to be a buffer zone? Central Americans began to flee in the 1980s in large numbers. They did so to escape the violence, the bloodshed of the civil wars, as well as for economic reasons, because such violence was very much creating economic problems in the region. In 1985, a study revealed that there were approximately 1 million Central Americans living in the United States, and approximately 1/5 of them came from Guatemala. US policymakers became extremely concerned with this growing migration. There were the traditional arguments. Migrants took jobs away from American citizens. They drained US welfare coffers. They came with different traditions, different language, different culture. But there was also arguments that we no longer hear today. They maintained that Central Americans were potential communist subversives. This is not surprising. This is during the Cold War. Central America was a hotspot. So the United States, not surprisingly, found a Cold War solution. While the Soviet Union had tried to protect itself behind the Iron Curtain from military invasion, the United States decided to use Mexico as a buffer zone to protect itself from the infiltration of Central Americans. Offshoring migration control to Mexico was not only going to help policymakers in that Central Americans would never reach the United States, but at the same time, it would help to curtail the growing accusations that the US government was mistreating, abusing Central American migrants. They would basically export human rights abuses to Mexico. Now, one thing is for the United States to want Mexico to stop transmigration. Another one is to get them to do it. But US officials had a valuable bargaining chip, and that was Mexicans' own migration to the United States. Like I demonstrated in my first book, since the 1970s, Mexican officials looked with favor, wanted Mexican migrants to go to the United States. And they made this clear to American politicians. In 1979, for instance, Mexico's Secretary of Foreign Affairs told US policymakers that the, quote, 800 Mexicans who managed to cross the border annually helped to partially solve the problem of unemployment in Mexico. US policymakers used their knowledge that the Mexican government had come to depend on Mexican immigration for its economy to getting it to do what they sought. At the 1984 bilateral conference between Mexico and the United States, US Secretary George Shultz warned Mexican officials that if Central Americans kept arriving to the United States, they would have no option but to further close the US-Mexico border. But of course, if they did so, this would stop not only Central Americans, but also Mexicans. Mexico's Secretary of Foreign Affairs understood the Faustian bargain that was being presented to him, and he accepted it. He replied to Schultz that the United States ought to, quote, make a clear distinction between Mexican migrants and Central American refugees. But he also said that Mexican authorities had, quote, the best disposition to help solve the Central American refugee problem. Among themselves, Mexico's policymakers admitted that they had no other option. They said, in the design of any migratory policy directed to the south of Mexico, the main point that they had to consider was US interests. Mexican administrators preferred to stop the flow of Central American migrants than risk heightened immigration enforcement against Mexicans. The principle of territorial sovereignty holds that nation states have the right to decide who enters the country. But by serving US interests and buffering migration, Mexico's immigration policies came to be determined by the United States rather than by Mexico's own immigration sovereign interests. Soon after speaking with Schultz, Mexican officials increased immigration controls. They sent over 100 additional migration officers to Chiapas in southern Mexico. They made it harder for Central Americans to obtain tourist visas and other migratory documents, and they increased the policing against Central Americans in Mexico City. This rapid expansion of migratory control in Mexico created huge problems for Mexican officials. According to Mexico's law, if you apprehended and detained someone, you could only hold that person for 72 hours before deporting them. But according to Miguel Garcia Granados, who was the head of migration services in Mazatlan, Mexican authorities simply didn't have, these officers simply didn't have the resources to deport so many people because of the growing number of detentions that were occurring. Even so, US authorities were not content with allowing only Mexican officials to take control of these efforts. In 1989, the Immigration and Naturalization Service sent Immigration and Border Patrol agents to Mexico. Then, on September 3rd, 1990, the national newspaper El Sol de México quoted the U.S. Immigration District Director in Mexico City as declaring, quote, that he considered Mexico to be the main checkpoint of Central American illegals. It is clear that Mexico was becoming a buffer zone. But we must ask another question again. Why were immigration officers from the United States and Border Patrol agents in Mexico? This was a clear affront to Mexico's sovereignty. The offshoring of immigration control to Mexico successfully shifted the geographies of deportation. Since then, more Central Americans have been deported from Mexico than the United States. For instance, in 1991, Mexico deported 133,000 Central Americans, while the United States deported 5,000. From 2004 to 2018, Mexico deported 1.7 million Central Americans, while the United States deported 1.1 million. In other words, for Central American, Mexico has become the place with the greatest, that presents the greatest threat of deportation. By the late 1980s, the organizations that defended trans migrants also came to understand Mexico as a border zone. The cover of the U.S. Committee for Refugees report on Central Americans portrayed all of Mexico as part of an arm of the United States that was stopping. Here we can see a few Central American migrants. The arm was taking away Mexico's sovereignty, and the title "Running the Gauntlet" refers not only to this effort of Central Americans to avoid Mexican authorities, but to the medieval definition of gauntlet as a heavy glove with a very long cuff. Guatemalan migrants themselves came to see Mexico in a new way, as a border zone. The oral histories I conducted with Guatemalans trans migrants revealed that the memories of the territory itself were drastically different between those who crossed before the mid-1980s and those who crossed from the mid-1980s onward. Only those who migrated after the mid-1980s saw Mexico as a buffer zone that needed to be crossed. Of course, one can assume that when recalling while doing these oral history interviews, migrants' memories were shaped not only by what happened, but also by what happened to them after the fact. Still, there are notable differences between the narratives of those who crossed Mexico before the mid-1980s and those who crossed after the US came to pressure Mexico into becoming a buffer zone. Teresa Herrera, for example, recalls that when she migrated in the early 1970s, she knew that there were checkpoints throughout Mexico. So she asked the driver of a US passenger bus to help her out. And the driver said, "No worry, hop on. And every checkpoint, pretend to be asleep." So when immigration officers came onto the bus to see who was there, Teresa Herrera pretended to be asleep. The driver said, "She's my wife," and allowed the bus to go through. As Herrera's story reveals, by the 1970s, there were already checkpoints in Mexico, but migrants remember them as very easy to bypass. Those who crossed during these early years made a clear distinction between crossing Mexico and crossing the US-Mexico border. For example, Jaime Jimenez, who migrated in 1979, declared that he reached Tijuana in northern Mexico very, very easily, but that once he had to cross into the United States, he and other migrants had to walk over 12 hours under the scorching sun to be able to get through. For him, the barrier to enter the United States was the US-Mexico border. In contrast, those who migrated during this later period said that actually crossing the US-Mexico border was easier than traversing through Mexico. For example, Leon Ramos, who migrated in 1995, said, "Honestly, before leaving, I thought that US immigration enforcement was going to be worse. But no, all the shit is in Mexico." Now, it's important to note that those who migrated during the mid-1980s and early 1990s did not think that crossing into the United States was easier because migration control across the US-Mexico border had become easier. In fact, after 1986, when the United States passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the US-Mexico border became much more militarized. Migrants' depictions of the modes of transportation that they used while crossing Mexico also reveals how, after the mid-1980s, migrants came to see Mexico as a buffer zone. Most Guatemalans who migrated in the 1970s and early 1980s recall that they traveled either by car or on a passenger bus. In contrast, those who left Guatemala in the 1990s described that they were hidden in spaces under the bus, in little compartments under the bus. For example, Ramos described that when he migrated in 1995, the smuggling ring had modified the passenger bus so that it had this particular hidden compartment to hide migrants and that it was under the gears. The space was so constrained, he recalled, that, quote, when the driver stopped, the clutch would run through one's back and hurt it. People vomited and urinated inside this compartment, and when they were let out, most of them fainted. The differences between the memories of those who crossed in the 1990s and those who crossed earlier is very apparent. For instance, Jaime Rodriguez, who traversed Mexico in 1979 during this earlier period, had one main complaint. He hadn't been able to find a seat on the bus in which he was traveling because it was so packed. Riding on freight trains, otherwise known as La Bestia, the beast, was also much more prevalent among those who migrated in the early 1990s. This mode of transportation was the most dangerous way to reach the United States. Maria Garcia, who boarded La Bestia in 1995, recalls that whenever the train reached a checkpoint, migrants would jump off from the train, run around the checkpoint, and hop back on by grabbing onto a ladder that was behind every car. But this, of course, was a very dangerous maneuver. In fact, when Garcia tried to do it, it was raining and the ladder was slippery, so she fell and truly hurt her chest. Still, she had to continue running and hop on again because the train was about to depart. Garcia eventually got better from her chest, but even though she recovered, an uncounted number of migrants have lost their limbs and their lives to La Bestia. In the 1990s, Central Americans were also regularly extorted. After all, the fear of deportation meant that they wouldn't go to the state. Not only that, in a country where corruption was endemic, much of this violence was carried out by state officials. The narratives of the migrants who crossed during the 1990s all revealed that it was state agents who would extort them. Luis Parra said that the federal police officers stopped him and ordered him to pay a bribe, quote, and said that if I didn't give them money, they were going to give me away to migration officers. Edmundo Salas, the head of inspection of Mexico's migratory services, even admitted that Central Americans could only reach the United States after they, quote, passed through the filter of organic extortion that was mounted by migration officials, the state and the federal police, municipal officers, and the army. Mexican citizens also started to extort trans migrants. When migrants tried to hop on a bus drivers would ask for a bribe. Hotel owners, restaurant owners would ask them to pay extra money. If they refused to do so, these owners would not only refuse their services, but they would also threaten to call immigration officials on them. Even worse than extortion, trans migrants increasingly faced extremely violent crimes. Newspapers from the earlier period revealed that up to the mid-1980s, migrants did face violence, but it was committed generally by individuals and wasn't so violent. For example, a newspaper of 1980 that was published in Baja California considered it newsworthy that a migrant had been assaulted at gunpoint, at knife point, not even gunpoint at the time, and had to give all his money. In contrast, by the late 1980s and early 1990s, an increasing number of newspapers published stories about gang violence against Central Americans. They told incidents of torture, murder, and sexual abuse. In fact, sexual violence became so widespread that it haunts all of the narratives of those who crossed in the later period. As migrants traveled through harder terrains to avoid state officials, they became increasingly vulnerable. Feminist scholars and human rights organizations have shown how the militarization of the US-Mexico border led to increased sexual abuse against women. The same trend seems to have happened once Mexico became a buffer zone. Because women who are sexually abused often fear reporting or retelling their stories, we know with little precision how many women experience sexual violence. Despite these silences, most of the women I interviewed spoke about this issue. Patricia Contreras, for example, recalled that her coyote roped her and that he tried to rape her. And all the women I talked to said that they were witness of other forms of sexual abuse towards other women. So did migrant men. Leon Ramos described that, quote, if there was a good-looking woman, Mexican officials would touch her. They would do bad things. The Mexican government did little about it. In 1995, the National Commission for the Defense of Human Rights published a report about the various abuses that Central Americans were facing. It also stated that the mechanisms that human rights organizations had and the government had implemented were, quote, insufficient. In the years that followed, Mexican officials failed to implement the needed structures to protect Central American migrants. After all, they were still succumbing to US pressures to turn Mexico into a buffer zone and to convert Central Americans into an illegal and thus vulnerable population. In fact, Mexico's policymakers continued to succumb to such pressure well into the 21st century. President Obama pressured Mexico into stopping the flow of Central Americans in 2014 after a growing number of unaccompanied minors started to arrive to the US-Mexico border. Then President Trump threatened to introduce a tariff of up to 25% on all Mexican goods if Mexico did not stop the flow of Central Americans. Of course, the Mexican government had to do so. And just last December, Mexico's president declared that his administration would would no longer deport Central Americans or other migrants from Mexico. The next day, US officials flew to negotiate with Mexico. And then, almost immediately after, Mexico once again began to deport non-Mexican migrants. Now, Mexico could revert and go back to not deporting these folks. It would be a disaster for the Biden administration. Biden has become dependent on Mexico keeping its promises. It is clear that Americans' influence diluted Mexico's sovereign right to determine who could enter the country. But as we are now seeing, America's longstanding reliance on offshoring migration control to Mexico has also come to erode America's sovereignty to the point that Mexican government now has a hand on US elections. Mexico's position as a buffer zone has come at great costs to Mexico, to the United States, and primarily, of course, to trans migrants. And yet it has not stopped migration. Even though traversing through Mexico has become increasingly hard, migrants have kept coming. The number of Central Americans in the United States grew more than tenfold since 1980 and by more than 25% since 2010. Migrants tried to avoid bumping into officials. They paid extortion fees and they hoped for the best. After all, converting Mexico into a buffer zone did nothing to change the conditions in their home countries that were pushing them to leave. To make matters worse, the policy of offshoring migration control is only one of the deterrence policies that the US government has historically used to stop migration. This is one of the points that I make in the book that was just released last week, In the Shadow of Liberty. The book unpacks the complex history of immigration detention since its inception in 1891 to the present. It shows how detention is intricately linked to incarceration, how immigrant detention even come about. But it also shows the experiences of those held behind bars. One of the main arguments that I make is that when migrants arrive to the United States and they're stopped at the border, they come to lack all constitutional rights. They can be incarcerated, and up to now, 99% of all migrants who are incarcerated in for-profit prisons. They can be incarcerated for indefinite periods of time. They don't know when or even if they're going to be released. Migrants are incarcerated without being accused of committing a crime. They have no access to a trial. I tell this story by following the life of 4 different people who came during different periods of time and from different places. A Chinese migrant who arrived in 1891, a German Holocaust Jewish survivor who came in 1948, a Cuban migrant who arrived in 1980, and Fernando Arredondo, one of the men who was separated from his child as a result of Trump's zero tolerance policy. I chose their stories because they capture all of the main transformations in the US detention system. So I'm able to tell this broader story through them. I truly believe that deterrence is not the solution. It has not stopped migration, and it has come at tremendous human and legal and political costs to all countries involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. The floor, the table are open to questions and conversation.
Forgot there were questions. Yes, ask me anything you want.
You can sit.
Oh, I'm going to sit. Yeah, I'm tired. I just flew from California.
Yes, please introduce yourself as each people ask questions. It makes it. Yes.
Thank you. Are you aware of any proposals to set up an arrangement like the ones that the Turks and Syria have in Europe with respect to the offshoring of control? And if it hasn't happened or it hasn't arisen, what are the reasons? Is it simply that it is not viable in the specific circumstances of Mexico, both in physical or in political terms?
Actually, there have not been such agreements. The United States can just pressure Mexico into doing what it wants. And I actually blame US society for that. While the Syrian case received so much attention, the plight of Central Americans in Mexico has received basically none. I remember in 2014 when unaccompanied minors started arriving in huge numbers to the US-Mexico border. There was, I don't know if you remember, there was that horrible picture of the small boy in a red shirt who had drowned, and it was absolutely devastating. And it captured my attention. I was horrified, and it captured most people's attention. But what was happening in Mexico did not. Without such pressure, there won't be such agreements.
Hi, my name is Stu. How much control does Mexico have of its southern border? How challenging would it be to actually close the border? And what do we know that they may have extracted from United States? In the you referenced a deal during the Biden administration where they announced they weren't going to continue to export or deport rather.
Yeah. We don't know in that precise case what the United States offered or threatened. We just know that Antony Blinken flew to Mexico, and then the following day, Mexico changed its policies. What was the first part of the question? Sorry.
How much latitude does the Mexican government actually shut it off?
Crossing the Suchiate, which is the river between Mexico and Guatemala, is fairly easy. But Mexico has implemented extremely hard checkpoints to cross throughout the states of Veracruz and where the train or where buses pass. So that is very hard, and people are dying as a result. And nowadays, I talked a lot about the extortion that was happening from gangs, but nowadays, it's not even the Mexican government that controls it. It's primarily cartels. If you don't pay extortion fees to cartels, you're basically killed. We know that some of the biggest mass graves that have been found in Mexico are of trans migrants who didn't pay these extortion fees to cartels. So is it being patrolled? Yes. Is it being patrolled by the government? Yes. Not exactly the border zone itself, but the routes into the border. And if you think in the United States is the same, the border is not just the exact border, but the patrolling that occurs in the United States goes 100 miles into the United States. That's all considered the border. So in Mexico, it's kind of the same.
Yeah, the U.S. government has set up these safe mobility offices in the region as a way of allowing some legal pathways for Latin Americans and others to come to the U.S. You see those as part of the deterrence policy, or are they good things?
I feel that they're not enough. I feel that right now, the main policies that have been implemented by the United States are ones of offshoring migration control, just in a different way than the one that I talked about. And that is originally, not too long ago, through Title 42. Title 42 was a policy first introduced by the Trump administration, which said that because there was a health crisis in the United States, this was an arcane policy from the Second World War, but it said that because there was a health crisis in the United States, the US could prevent migrants from coming in. Even asylum seekers didn't have the right to ask for asylum. While they waited for Title 42 to be reverted, and it passed under Trump, but it continued under Biden, migrants waited in northern Mexico in encampments under the worst of conditions. People were being sexually assaulted, they were being robbed, and still those conditions were better for them than returning to their home countries. The Remain in Mexico policy was similar. It wasn't as effective, but it also made migrants wait in northern Mexico for their turn to come. Now, migrants can apply to enter the United States. They have to wait. Asylum seekers have to wait in northern Mexico and use an app. But that app really gives preference to those who have good internet because there's so much. It opens up at a certain hour in the morning and it's just random who gets in. So you could have arrived much earlier than other migrants and still not get in. And people are waiting in northern Mexico. So the detention of migrants has basically become northern Mexico. And it's very dangerous. So do I think that these policies are important? Yes, I don't think they're sufficient. I don't think they're what do they say in the United States? A drop in the bucket.
I'm David Sartorius. I teach at the University of Maryland, and hello, thank you for this. I'm curious about, I mean, it's an interesting argument that sort of US-Mexican relations have like the figure, there's a reality of Central American migration, but Central America figure, it's this cipher into which a lot is put. And I'm wondering sort of to think about Cuban and Chinese migration today across the border, do those non-Mexican and non-Central American groups shape the template through which these relationships are negotiated? In other words, do kind of Cuban migrant, does the specter of Cuban migration and Chinese migration through the US-Mexico border alter a model that's been set up with respect to Central America? Does that make sense?
Yes. In some ways, it continues the same. It just has increased the number of people who are affected by this policy. But it's interesting that you bring out Cuban migration because, like I said, converting Mexico into a buffer zone was not one of the only policies that occurred in the 1980s. You know, detention happened, but another one was interdiction. And interdiction, similar to Mexico becoming a buffer zone, was converting, you know, the Florida Straits into a place where both Haitian and Cuban migrants were being interdicted, so they never arrived to the US border and then deported or sent to Guantanamo.
Yes, my name is Roberta Najou. I'm a fellow at the Wilson Center. In your contact, in your research with Mexican migrants to the United States, are you aware of them having a political point of view, voting, or having a view that would affect, you know, that would have an effect on their family who votes
In Mexico.
in Mexico?
Absolutely.
And what would be that, please?
Oh, nowadays. Well, people are very much, so what happens is that up until recently, not so recently anymore, Mexican migrants couldn't vote, but they still held a huge sway on Mexican elections because, for example, they sent the remittances, they created these hometown associations. They were truly politically involved back in Mexico. And they called their family members and were like, you know what? The person you should vote for is blah. And as a result of this sort of negotiation and pressure, eventually Mexicans were also allowed to vote in the United States, although it's very hard for them to do so. So it is primarily through the voice, by calling family members and telling them. People are against Trump. Migrants are very much against Trump. The Latino population in the United States voted surprisingly in large numbers for Trump. It's embarrassing to say, but that is not true for migrants. Migrants oppose Trump. They very much felt criminalized, which they were. And so they were asking their family members to support the person who most supports Trump. And they see that as AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So Andrés Manuel López Obrador, I saw you raise your eyebrow. I also don't support him. I don't know who I support because, as always, Mexican elections are on the terrible side. But above all, I do not support him. Mexico is about to have its first female president, I have to say. So that's exciting. So, and the person who's about to follow AMLO is Claudia Sheinbaum, and people are asking, migrants are asking their family members to vote for her because AMLO was so much supported. I said Trump, as being against Trump. No, as being against Trump. Sorry if I said the opposite. Yeah, they see that him about, and they also see him. Migrants want to return to their hometowns. Like, even though almost no one returns, this idea that eventually you'll make money and go back home remains. And they see AMLO as the defender of the poor. Most Mexicans do. AMLO is still enormously popular in Mexico. There is no question that he's the most popular politician nowadays.
I have a tiny question if I can.
When do migrants become an American problem? Because I have the impression that
An American problem. Is that what you said?
because I have the impression that they are received mostly by the US government as a Mexican government's program.
Are we talking about Central Americans or
No,
Mexican?
I'm sorry, Central Americans.
No, they consider them primarily
Central
a
American.
US problem. Like they don't want them to reach the United States,
Okay.
but then they pressure Mexico into stopping this migration. Was that your question?
Now, my question has to do with the fact that maybe if there is a possibility of a new Marshall Plan as
Of a new Marshall Plan?
for Central America.
Many have been implemented, those sort of plans of investing heavily in Central America.
Do you
They-
think it would work?
No, I do not think it would work if implemented as the Marshall Plan.
Uh-huh.
Right now, the Central America does not just require deep economic investment. There's, terrible violence in the region. A lot of the folks who are leaving it is because of that violence. In places like El Salvador, where violence has decreased, where the gangs have decreased, there's still massive targeting of certain folks. For example, queer communities are fleeing El Salvador. So a Marshall Plan, if we just send money, do I think it's going to work? No, especially because who the money has been sent to has traditionally helped richer folks than, the people who are actually migrating. It hasn't trickled down. Do I think US investment in Central America is indispensable and would help? Yes, but it needs to be implemented differently than it has up to now.
It would be implemented with a program of that would again go against national sovereignty because you would need an American authority to.
I don't think we should send an American authority. I think
No,
there's
I don't think that.
that's not what I'm suggesting. No.
No, I was trying to think of a different plan, different from those that have been presented, in order to stop
Like what?
Central American migration. I'm sorry.
Like what?
Like what?
Yeah.
Like, well, giving more money, you say doesn't work.
Sorry?
Giving more money, you say doesn't work.
Well, I think sending more money is indispensable. I just think how that money is sent and to whom is what we
How
need to
it-
be thinking
well,
about.
how-
And also we need to be thinking about how to curtail gang violence, which is rampant. And to
Okay.
do so with a government that is not authoritarian like the one that we're seeing in El Salvador.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about kind of the vertical sorry about that, but we're too close together. I'll back down. But I wanted to ask you about kind of the vertical border of it all. And I wanted to ask you about the absorption of non-Mexican migrants in Mexico that looks a little bit different from detention and from deportation and is very much tied to those two things. But I've kind of seen more and more stories of people who are
Settling in this.
very much like wanted to go to the US and then it just becomes untenable and they end up somewhere like Mexico City and they're like, actually, this is better. And there's stories of like Haitian migrants selling tamales now and like all of these. So I'm curious how that fits into your narrative. And also, have you kind of come across people having a regional sense of where in Mexico are kind of the hot spots when it comes to kidnapping? Because I've heard kind of, the South is really rough. The North is also really rough. And that's where a lot of the kind of kidnapping start occurring. And then kind of the Central Valley being a little bit of a safer zone. I'm curious if that's something that you've come across.
Yeah, so the most dangerous zones in Mexico are, you cross El Suchiate, and then basically there's like a region in Chiapas that's very hard. Then from there to Puebla, it's extremely hard. There's a lot of violence there. In Veracruz, in eastern Mexico, there's a lot of violence there. But then the violence sort of diminishes until you reach Monterrey in northern Mexico, and that's where it sparks again. So yeah, central Mexico, but Veracruz could also be considered central Mexico. So central western Mexico is easier for migrants to cross at the moment. There's just fewer transportation options that go that way. Yes, a lot of Central Americans have been settling in Mexico. They settle primarily in Mexico City and in northern Mexico. And it's interesting because Mexican citizens have always tried to distinguish themselves from Central Americans. Mexicans are like, you know what? We are really not indigenous. We're mestizos. We are different from them. They're criminals. They're communists. We're not. So there has been a lot of racism against Central Americans. And still, Central Americans find that crossing the US border nowadays with Trump is so hard. Crossing through Mexico is so hard that trying to settle in Mexico City where there is less policing is the way to go. Also, waiting for asylum in northern Mexico is legal, so people are settling there. It's interesting because when Haitians first started arriving, they were treated much better than Central Americans because there was going to be no confusion between Mexicans and Haitians. There was going to be confusion between Mexicans and Central Americans. So while we had a history of saying, oh, no, we're not Central Americans, we didn't have a history of saying, oh, no, we're Haitians. But as more Haitians arrived, the reception and welcoming of Haitians has declined dramatically.
I'm going to put, this isn't quite a question. It's in fact sort of a secondhand addition.
Comment.
Well, not even a comment, but it points to a moment of relative positive in all of this that you recognize. Things were better for Central Americans in the late 70s before things really got hard in the mid 80s. What I want to do is report secondhand on the research that is happening these days by a young Georgetown PhD student named Marcela Harden, who's working and interviewing people at the Guatemalan Chiapas border, looking at going back to the 70s through the 90s. And briefly, what the macro political trajectory only reinforces everything you've said. But what she has found astonishing is that in the late 70s, and that time period matters, while two things were simultaneously, things were starting to explode and get violent in Guatemala and in Central America, but the oil boom still lived nearby in Tabasco. And that had some ramifications for rural prosperity in Chiapas. She found not only a positive reception, a welcoming of Central American migrants in Chiapas rural community. Welcome, live among us, join us, work with us. We can be part of a community. And she found local political NGO people organizing to defend them, in contrast to things that were happening in Mexico City and the like, where there are turns to do this. And yes, it's a particular moment. The revolution is just starting. The oil boom had not crashed, which it would do in 81. But it's at least a moment that says there was a moment of another way. And about a year and a half from now, I suspect we'll have studies from Marcela to bring that conversation.
That's wonderful. I would encourage her to see in the 1960s because they were also welcomed by coffee growers. Thank you all. I really appreciate it.
of our conversation today. You now may. All right, welcome back. Our second presentation is by Marta Guerrero. She too is originally from Mexico. Came to Georgetown, where she earned her BSFS in culture and politics in 2019, and where I had the great pleasure of getting to work with her. She went on to get her MS in journalism at Columbia, where during and after her time there, she wrote and continues to write regularly for the Mexican bilingual news site Informe Confidencial and other sources, where she then reported on undocumented house cleaners and delivery workers, keeping New York City alive through COVID, simply said. And it was a mix, by the way, of undocumented, mostly indigenous, Guatemalan and Mexican delivery workers and house cleaners, keeping the city alive through COVID. She is now in the history PhD program at Yale, where she has done some interesting work, opening new perspectives to me on the role of the undocumented in both suffering and then picking up after 9/11 in New York City. So I pass the microphone to Marta.
That's very wonderful introduction. Very happy to be here. Thank you for putting this event together, and I'm just so honored to be sharing this panel with people that I've admired for the longest time. So today I'm mainly going to be talking about work. I'm going to be talking about a very specific kind of service work in New York City that historically has been performed and that today continues to be performed by largely undocumented immigrants. And so this work has looked like many different things that a lot of us don't really think about. Cleaning offices, making sure that big buildings in New York City are up and running, that elevators are up and running, cleaning homes. So thinking about luxurious apartments, penthouses somewhere up there, and also homes in suburbs around the city. Service work has also meant carrying construction materials, helping out in construction sites. But in New York City, service work has mainly looked like staffing the food service sector. So the food service sector is this kind of big umbrella in which we include kitchens of upscale restaurants, we include pantries, we include grocery stores, food markets, hotels, and everything that we think about when we, come into New York City and want to dine and want to enjoy the city's good food. And so over the last 50 years, but even more so over the last 30 years, undocumented service work has been a very important part of city life. It has been historically very discreet, very quiet, and most importantly, very constant. So we're thinking about different generations of workers who have come in to work every day without a lot of us really noticing them. This work has also helped expand services in New York City. We think of a city with a hyper development of services. We think of New York, and it has significantly reduced the labor cost of this expansion. It has subsidized a lot of that growth, and it has standardized a lot of services. So before I go into the histories that I want to share with you today, I want to give you a little bit of a background of who I'm talking about. So this is a Mexican series, and there's a lot of Mexicans in the story, but there's also a lot of non-Mexicans. So there's four kind of big trends that we see since the 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s, up to today, that have a lot to do with the demographics of the undocumented. So who are these people has changed over time. So thinking about more women, more teenagers, more unaccompanied minors, and minors in general coming into the metropolitan Northeast, and specifically to New York City. The national origins of this population has also changed quite a bit since the 1980s, and it's still changing today. But what we have is essentially a workforce that was largely Mexican and Caribbean in the late 1970s, early 1980s, has become more diverse over time. So we have a lot of Central and South Americans now who are working in New York City. We have West Africans, and we have people from South and Southeast Asia today. And so those two changes about who is emigrating have also interacted with the undocumented in the US becoming a more US fixed population. And so, I was going to cite Ana Minian on this, and then I was like, yes, she knows what this entails. But so since the late 1980s, when the Immigration Reform and Control Act passes and when the border starts becoming more and more militarized, we also see Mexican migrants and other migrants as well being more and more reticent to cross the border again, to engage in any form of temporary migration. And we see people becoming more and more of a US population, but by way of adaptation. We don't really think about why that happened. And then we have these big changes in the economy in the late 1970s and in the early 1980s that only exacerbate it over time. And so we have an economy with more corporate employers that look a little different than we might think, not just the big companies, but the big contractors, the big subcontractors, and just a series of intermediaries and brokers that are powering an economy in which an undocumented immigrant can be hired by a big corporation, but being hired indirectly. So we're thinking about this kind of big tiered system in which people are working for very different companies, but might be serving kind of a larger company. And so, like I said, this kind of recruitment of undocumented workers in New York City was fully conscious. It was purposeful. It was not this accident that we sometimes kind of go with those narratives of, well, the undocumented work, that's just what they do when they come in the US. And so I'm trying to kind of think through how they work and where they work. So the working lives of the undocumented have definitely been a part of the histories of immigration that we talk about. But work has almost become this kind of very natural, very ahistorical thing that just happens, and we kind of just assume that once migrants are able to cross the border successfully, they're going to be hired by someone. And we also have ideas about immigration enforcement in which undocumented work becomes this aberration almost. It becomes this thing that happens before the system finally kind of arrives and gets these individuals and either detains them, deports them, or a mix of both. And so what I'm mainly after here today is to talk about how a system of deportation and detention has certainly expanded over the last 40 to 50 years, but then at the same time, the system's discretion has been really helpful for certain actors to keep profiting off the work of these people as that same system is chasing them relentlessly. This understated relationship between capitalists and the US government is tricky. It's hard to kind of pin down, and it almost looks like something that is uncontrollable. But the harder we look at how these people are working, and not only near the border or in the Southwest, but thinking about major US cities and thinking about all kinds of industries that are not just farm work anymore, but very much include farm work, as we know. Thinking about this kind of work that has become more flexible and more prevalent over time and also more invisible over time is kind of what I'm after. If we could hit the first slide. Okay, so I want to get started today with two photos that I'm going to show you. So the first one was taken just a few days after the terrorist attacks of September 11 in 2001. This was a bike that was left locked just a few blocks away from the World Trade Center. And it didn't really take a long time for people to start leaving flowers, letters, rosaries, and photos as a form of remembrance and as a form of honoring the anonymous owner of the bike. And so there was a sign that you can't really see there that was right across the street that said, "En memoria de los delivery boys que murieron September 11, 2001. So in memory of the delivery boys who died in 9/11. I'm going to be using the word delivery worker quite a bit, but the words with which migrants have actually understood what they do day in and day out, delivering food and other items for New Yorkers, there's two words. One is delivery boy. There's a number of groups that are self-described as associations and community groups of delivery boys, which is, points to the largely kind of male undocumented workforce that still is very much in the streets of New York today. There are some women, but it is largely a male workforce. And so the other word is the liberista, which you're going to hear me say a lot of times today too. This is a Spanglish word. It's used more prevalently even today than delivery boy, and it points to a very specific sector in which the undocumented have worked over time. Carla Cornejo Villavicencio, who is an undocumented Ecuadorian novelist, wrote the following about her dad. Her dad was one of the, quote, delivery boys, a very proud delivery boy who used to service offices in the financial district in the early 2000s and would complete breakfast, lunch, and dinner orders. So she wrote, a blueberry muffin and black coffee, 2 cranberry scones and 3 coffees, 2 cream, 1 sugar, a single croissant and a single coffee sent back because it was brought with white sugar and not Splenda. There was no delivery minimum, so my father delivered it all. And so Cornejo Villavicencio is one of the few people who kind of give us a little bit of an insight into this world in the early 2000s. After interviewing her father and interviewing colleagues of her father who lost a lot of friends in 9/11, she concluded that many of the undocumented workers who died during 9/11, quote, worked in restaurants, in housekeeping, in security, and they were also delivery men. And so this abandoned bike of the Liberista represented a much larger workforce that died during the 9/11 attacks. In the days after 9/11, the community organization Asociación Tepeyac de New York, which was mainly catering to Latinx communities and immigrant communities, compiled a list of up to 700 missing people. They were cooks, they were dishwashers, they were servers, they were delivery boys and deliveristas, they were cleaners, and they were childcare providers. And so even though hundreds of these people were missing and likely killed, ultimately the official death toll of 9/11 only took a couple of those names in because it was so hard to verify who these people were in the first place. Some of the names that were recovered by the Tepeyac organizers included Juan Ortega Ramos, who was a 31-year-old immigrant who died while doing deliveries for the Fine and Shapiro restaurant at the South Tower. It included Fabian Ramiro Soto, a 31-year-old born in Ecuador who got killed at his place of work near the Twin Towers. And Enemencio Dario Hidalgo, who came from the Dominican Republic and was a 40-year-old prep cook at Windows on the World, who was covering the morning shift. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Windows of the World in a little bit. And then we had Ivan Carpio, who was originally from Peru, who turned 25 years old on September 11, and who was working in the kitchen of the Windows on the World restaurant in the North Tower around 8 a.m. And so this brings us to the second picture. This is a ghost bike. This photo was taken in January of 2021. The bike is painted white. It has a lot of kind of similar mementos and flowers attached to it as the other bike. And it belonged And it was kind of a remembrance and an honoring to Juan Licurgo Cruz, who was an undocumented app delivery worker from Guerrero, Mexico, who was killed after crashing an SUV parked in a bike lane in the Bronx. And so Cruz marked what was the first casualty of 2021, after what had already been one of the deadliest years for undocumented delivery workers. And so in 2020, at the height of the COVID pandemic, nearly half of New York City's cycling fatalities were delivery workers. All of them were undocumented, and details about their names, very similar to 9/11, were simply not retrievable or recoverable. And so back in 2001, this bike belonged to someone who likely worked for local restaurants, whether those were local businesses or chain restaurants, as well as kind of high-end restaurants and catering services. When it came to Cruz's bike, this was a new hiring scheme that was very recent, that was very tied to how these workers were perceived, and that the more I talk about it, I think you're going to realize this is a very big part of lives in cities today. So Cruz worked for delivery apps. Delivery apps are publicly traded companies. They're tech companies, and they have names that most of us recognize. Uber Eats, DoorDash, Grubhub, Instacart, the kind of thing that we relied on a lot during the pandemic to get our food, and the kind of thing that we still rely on today. And so over the last 2 decades, but more so over the last 10 years, and even more so during the pandemic and since the pandemic, delivery apps have emerged as this alternative for all kinds of businesses to deliver their goods in a larger scale. And so how do delivery apps work? They essentially are third-party intermediaries. They connect low-wage delivery workers with businesses. That's kind of their big pitch. And that way, a lot of restaurants don't have to hire in-house staff that does their deliveries for them anymore. They're exceptionally popular now with big chain corporations. So we think about Walmart, we think about Walgreens, we think about all of these kind of big names that are now relying on these companies to provide for that labor. And so something interesting to think about is in 2001, a lot of the workers that were doing deliveries were likely day laborers. They were contracted for limited periods of time when delivery was kind of bigger in the city, and they would be kind of in these very kind of informal setups in which they worked for a couple of days, they worked for a couple of weeks for different businesses, and they were kind of always parked around Lower Manhattan because they were also looking for that work. When it comes to delivery apps, that model of flexible, temporary, and very precarious and very underpaid work got a name, which is the independent contractors that are powering the gig industry today. So an independent contractor, more popularly known as a gig worker, is someone who, while working full-time for these corporations, and a lot of these people, if not most of them, including its undocumented workforce in New York City, are working full-time for these apps, but are being perceived and drawn into law as independent contractors. So they're meant to kind of come in and out, not really have any benefits associated with full-time work, and just kind of be these perpetual gig workers. And so in the world of delivery apps in 2021, in the middle of a still raging pandemic, Cruz's death would go unreported. It would create no financial or legal obligations for the corporation that employed him. And it would be added to a long list of workers who died on the job without any sort of recognition. And so very similar to the list that I just shared that Asociación Tepeyac put together in 2001, we kind of have that same list in 2021. So before Cruz, at least 12 delivery workers were killed in 2020. They were all in their 20s and 30s. Most of them were the primary figure in their families, and also the person who was supporting communities abroad. And so we have Victorio Hilario Guzman, who was originally from Mexico, who died in September of 2020 while he delivered a $4 order of Popeyes in the Bronx. We have Alfredo Cabrera Liconia, also from Mexico, who was run over by a truck in Queens. And we have Guatemalan Juan Tiu Casash, who collided with an SUV while doing deliveries in Brooklyn. So we could move to. And so these are a couple of more photos of 9/11. If we could move to the next slide. If we could do that. And so these are the people that I found in 9/11 as I was kind of tracing my way back after knowing these workers in their most contemporary form in New York City. I was very curious about where they came from, about who they were, and about just how long they'd been doing these kinds of works. And so I'm going to paint a picture for you of how I kind of came across these workers in the first place. Like Professor Dutino mentioned, I was a fresh graduate student in Columbia. I was studying journalism. I was very excited about being a journalist. I recently moved to New York City, and it was January 2021. It was kind of still a raging pandemic, and the streets were very much empty. But all I saw were these deliveristas. They were out in the street all hours of day. And I started kind of finding out more about, who these people were. They came largely from Mexico, from Central America. They also came from the Caribbean. A lot of them came from West Africa, and a lot of them came from South and Southeast Asia. So this was already a multi-ethnic and a multinational workforce that had once been largely Mexican and Central American and was no longer just that. And so during the pandemic, these deliveristas became essential workers. They were formally classified as essential workers along doctors, nurses, and others. As it became more clear that delivery apps were a way to keep socially distanced New Yorkers fed, it was a way to reach the vulnerable, and it was a way to deliver more than food. So thinking about groceries, thinking about all of the things that we needed during the pandemic that so many people couldn't go out to get. And so because I came across these workers, these photos are all from 2000 and 2001, I came across these workers today, well, in 2021, but they're still very much around today. And I started thinking a lot about this symbiotic and this paradoxical relationship that we've come to understand between a system that is rooted in detention and deportation and deterrence and trying to keep migrants out in the larger numbers. And then a system that is very discretional, that very much needs these workers and very much seeks these workers out. And, we do have a sense that this happens, and we have a very general sense, and we kind of attribute it to hypocrisy of the US government, kind of a bureaucracy that is just not enough. We think about racism, nativism, and we think about kind of these discussions that are very sensational and very national about what is happening in the border and why can't we stop these migrations, right? And so in this sense, these workers have been thought to be kind of errors in the system, and their stories have very much been told through that lens. So when I was looking at the working conditions of these people and also of workers just in general during the early 2000s who were undocumented, I came across this very kind of curious federal policy that came of age in the late 1980s that was called employer sanctions. So employer sanctions were this very kind of innocuous, very boring, very dry piece of federal policy that got passed in 1986. And so in the simplest words, employer sanctions were a series of fines and penalties that were created to punish US employers who were hiring undocumented workers. They're an immigration policy that we're certainly familiar with, that we certainly know did not work to deter immigration, but we're a little bit less familiar with what employer sanctions did on the ground and how they got a lot of undocumented immigrants on the books. They got them on the books through mismatched social security numbers, fake identification. So thinking about driver's licenses, INS documents. We have these ideas of undocumented workers mainly being off the books and kind of hidden away from a system that wants to find them and that is actively chasing them. And we have less ideas about what happened to the workers who were very much were staying put in the same places, who were working on the books, and who were contributing to things like Social Security, that were paying taxes, that were very much doing things that American workers were doing without any sort of recognition. And so 9/11, I've found, laid bare this system of the fake papers. And so the fake papers have been largely used to understand kind of this embodied illegality of immigrants. We never thought about where those papers came from. We just knew that these people did not have the right papers, they were forged, and that they used them to work, but we never really thought long and hard about how much employers were in on this system. And so narratives of kind of the sly employer or the oblivious employer who takes in these documents and has no real way of verifying if they're fake or real is kind of the story that we tell ourselves. And employment authorization is just this very kind of boring conversation that we have about how migrants are actually working. But we don't really think about by 2005, this system had made a lot of money that wasn't necessarily just tied to the money that migrants themselves were making. These contributions added up to about 7 billion paid to Social Security and about 1.5 billion paid to Medicare by holders of these mismatched documentation. So these were people who were working largely on the books. There were people showing fraudulent identification, and a lot of their employers were either taking that ID or either providing that ID for their workers, and everything was kind of kept safe from this system of enforcement. And so something else that I found was that these fake papers showed a very big contradiction when it came to what to do with these immigrants. If we could move to the next slide, we have a couple more pictures here of people taking, if we could do the next one, working, like I said, flower markets, and yeah, if we can. And so we have kind of the post 9/11 immigration crackdown, right? Which is very prevalent in our narratives. We all kind of understand that after 9/11, a lot of things changed and that this system became all the more aggressive, trying to deport, to detain, and to deter as many people as it could. But what is interesting is that the immigration crackdown didn't really touch the workplace. And it didn't really touch workplace enforcement, which to this day is just employer sanctions. To this day, there is a culture of great tolerance for hiring undocumented workers. There are a lot of incentives to do it. And even now, in a period in which we get to verify if a Social Security number is fraudulent or not, it's still something that a lot of companies choose not to do. And it's also something that they're not legally obligated, or at least not legally obligated, but it's not something that gets enforced whether they do it or not. And so at the height of 9/11, at the height of this anti-immigrant sentiment and legislation, we see that the workplace gets policed less and less and less. If we could move to the next slide. And so then we have this big reason why, even if the system is intent on keeping as many migrants as it can out by different methods, New York is very reliant on undocumented labor at the height of 9/11. And so Ground Zero is a big pile of highly toxic waste that needs to get cleaned, and it needs to get cleaned fast. And so we have city contractors and subcontractors. We have this whole scheme of private companies and private contractors that are providing the labor for what is ultimately a federally funded and a state-funded effort. So the same government that is targeting these migrants is also very comfortable with these people cleaning Ground Zero. And one of the kind of also big paradoxes is that we see how being an undocumented worker immediately strips workers of rights, whether they're conscious of it or not. And so we think about a lot of these workers getting chronically sick, as we know happened with a lot of first responders, a lot of them passing away due to this chronic illness, but hardly any being able to tap into the health services that were promised to those who suffered from 9/11. And then we also get legislation that is still very much not passed about these undocumented workers wanting to claim a green card, wanting to claim residence because of the labor that they conducted, and the system saying, not really, that's not something that's going to happen. If we could move to the next slide, we have some photos there that I wanted to share with you about who ended up cleaning Ground Zero. And so we have, again, a multi-ethnic, a multinational population that was very much around in Lower Manhattan before and that was immobilized. A lot of them earning substandard wages, a lot of them not getting paid or getting underpaid. And most importantly, all of them expected to do this work, even at the height of the anti-immigrant crackdown. If we could move a couple slides. Just another one. Sorry, there's a lot of pictures, but I thought they were fun to share. And then we have some materials by Asociación Tepeyac. Okay, so I'm going to move on to what I'm actually here to talk about. That was a little bit of a long intro, but I wanted to share the work that I've been doing in 9/11 and kind of these connections. So I'm going to talk about two movements of the Libreristas Unidos and the Excluded Workers Fund. They were both migrant-led social campaigns that happened in 2021. If we could move to the next slide. Here's a little timeline, hopefully to make things a little clearer. So these workers were organizing largely in 2020, in the summer and the fall of 2020. And the Excluded Workers Fund, which was $2.1 billion in retroactive pandemic payments for migrants passed in the spring of 2021. And then we have the worker law protection package that passes in City Council in September 2021. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about who the Libreristas Unidos were first. So most of these organizers were indigenous. Most of them were Mexican and Central American, hence the name in Spanish. And they were working full-time for the country's top delivery apps during the pandemic. And then the second story is the Excluded Workers Coalition, which then led to the Excluded Workers Fund. So there's a lot of alliteration there. But so the Excluded Workers Coalition was this multi-ethnic and multinational immigrant-led coalition that successfully pushed for money that had never come quite in this way for undocumented workers. And in addition to the money, which represented all of the pandemic relief that undocumented workers did not receive through a moment of great emergency and through a moment in which their labor, again, we counted on and we relied on and we used in different ways. And so this fund was meant to kind of bring those payments to people who never received them. And so by the summer of 2020, these movements were already very visible in the city. They were already organizing and they were bringing a lot of attention to the ways in which the undocumented were again perceived as being outside of the system, as being not entitled to any recognition and to any concrete help during the pandemic, but at the same time, undocumented workers being exactly the kind of worker that we counted on to do the most dangerous jobs. And so to talk a little bit more about the Libreristas Unidos, if we can move to the next slide, I think there are two things to kind of to understand. So one, I've talked a little bit about how delivery apps work. And the other one I've talked about kind of what the pandemic does to delivery apps. So if we think about delivery apps now, they are perceived as highly successful. They're perceived as very profitable, as something to invest in if you're a financier, a venture capitalist, and something that's growing very rapidly. And DoorDash and Uber Eats were created fairly recently, 2013 and 2014, and they already account for over 90% of food delivery app sales in the US. So when I'm talking about employers and workers, I'm really talking about a handful of employers managing thousands and thousands of workers. During the pandemic, the US delivery app market grew by over 50% just in the first few months of 2020. And by the end of that year, DoorDash came out as a public company and it was valued over $60 billion. And so as more and more businesses started relying on delivery apps to survive, to make payments to their workers and to just not go under during the pandemic, chain restaurants and stores began using delivery apps a lot more. And so you had this kind of larger infrastructure that we'd never really seen. And so this led to hiring more and more workers. Uber Eats signed up at least 30,000 new workers, a lot of them undocumented, in March and April of 2020. And so here, I come again with kind of the employer sanctions, the lax enforcement, the discretional enforcement, even though these were moments in which we had narratives and very much realities about the border being closed off, about no one coming in, Title 41, all of these things, which were very much true and very much materially kind of there. We also have the signing up of new undocumented workers to do work that Americans are really not looking to do. And so as they become essential workers, a lot of these people start realizing just how dangerous the work is in that moment. If we could move to the next slide. Well, we have a little bit of, so that you recognize them when you see them on the street. We have kind of this growth during the pandemic, and then we have the delivery workers. So we could move one slide, one more. Okay, here we go. So Gustavo Arce was a 39-year-old indigenous Guatemalan who had become a delivery app worker in 2018. He'd been working for about 10 years in restaurants and construction sites, and then he became a deliverista. So during the pandemic, the undocumented worker said that he mostly felt like he was working for a ghost on his phone, this faceless boss that he never really got to see. And so Akche shared that, quote, with the pandemic, the ghosts started acting even more and more heartless. It's like they figured out that we needed the job too much to complain, and that if we complained, no one would really listen. And so Akche was biking around 50 to 60 hours a week. He was breaking $500, sometimes a little less. He was a full-time employee with no claims to that full-time status. He was an independent contractor just working his way through the city. If we could move to the next slide. Here we have some more photos. Sorry, I just have a lot of photos that I really love showing people because they're really good. Okay, and so here we have Jonan Huerta, who was also one of the founders of Deliveristas Unidos. He was a 33-year-old indigenous Mexican from Mexico City, and he was very much a good friend of Gustavo. And so I just want to walk you through what the problem was for these delivery workers. So one of the main things that started kind of galvanizing people and started uniting them was the fact that they couldn't use the restroom in the restaurants where they were picking up the food. And so what this meant was the restaurants were essentially saying, you don't really work for us. And then delivery apps would say, we don't really have a way to enforce, you being let to use the restroom. So you also technically don't work for us. You're an independent contractor, and we don't really need to provide this bathroom for you. And so Deliveristas Unidos really started out as a Facebook group sharing locations of bathrooms and sharing where to go if you couldn't find a public bathroom. And again, thinking about 2020, this was a moment where public facilities just weren't really open in New York City. So there wasn't an alternative to the restroom that they were being denied. And so as they started collecting more and more stories of immigrants who were working in delivery apps, Deliveristas Unidos started realizing that the problem was also that they were constantly being, their tips were constantly disappearing from the app. They would get a certain amount of money and then it would go away. They didn't really have a way of enforcing how much they were getting paid and why. And this was all up to a little screen on their phone. So the ghost moved really quickly. It told them how much they were making. It told them where to go, and it told them how much food and how much stuff to get. And so if we could move one slide more. Well, these are photos that I really enjoy showing people. But so they start showing up in the streets and they start talking about these things to New Yorkers, and they start saying, we are serving you and we are just getting this treatment from our bosses that is just very abusive and no one is really doing anything about it. If we could move a couple more slides. Here we have some really cool photos. Okay. And so as you can see here, Deliveristas Unidos organizes around a set of demands. And one of the biggest things other than the bathrooms is we don't have a way of verifying how much we're making in terms of our wages and our tips. So delivery apps essentially just kind of merge those two and then calculate a sum for delivery workers. And they're also not really able to claim the independent status that they have. So they're still full-time workers. They're expected to accept every single order. And if they don't accept those orders, there are actual consequences, which means they get internally rated by their employer, the apps. And then if they don't prove to be committed full-time workers, even though they're legally really not, they're punished in very specific ways. They're locked out of the app. They can't work anymore. And they just receive less work in general. So you can see here that the Libreristas Unidos was very effective in voicing what the problems were. And we get a local legislation that is actually very close to their demands. If we could move a slide more, we have kind of the implementation, and this is going to be relevant because the last part of this legislation was a minimum wage. The Libreristas are now entitled to a 19.56 delivery minimum wage in New York City. And we're going to see what apps are doing to fight that. But we can move to the next slide. We have a couple more. We have some photos here. Okay, so just quickly about the Excluded Workers Fund, which is kind of the last leg of what I came to talk to you about today. So the slogan of the Excluded Workers Coalition was essential but excluded. And it tried to underline these contradictions that I've been talking about this group of workers that New York both relied on and rejected. And so we had kind of different actions that these workers were part of. They were protesting, they were calling out the city for not paying them any relief, even though they represented over half of essential workers in the city, and even though they were also among the most affected by unemployment and underemployment. So we could do the next slide. Here we have some actions by the Excluded Workers Coalition, and we could move a couple more. Here we arrived to kind of the meat of this story, which is the hunger strike by the Excluded Worker Coalition. And so we have 85 immigrant workers, all of them undocumented, who were on strike and were fasting for over 3 weeks. So 23 days without food. Around 96% of these strikers were actually undocumented women. A lot of them were from Mexico and a lot of them were from Central America. And I just want to kind of do a little bit of a dive into who these people were. So we have the three longest standing strikers. We have Rubiela Correa from Colombia, we have Ana Ramirez from Mexico, and we have Felipe Hidrobo from Ecuador. And so together they fasted over 1,000 hours in this period. So Rubiela Correa was a 49-year-old undocumented immigrant from Colombia. Felipe Hidrobo was from Ecuador, and Ana was from Mexico. They all lost their jobs in the undocumented service sector. None of them had formal agreements with their employers. They were all doing either day labor or domestic work. And they lost their jobs really quickly, and they realized that even though people were very reliant on their work, they were also the first to be fired. And so Hidrobo was one of the biggest supporters of doing a hunger strike over other forms of protest, because back in Ecuador, he had witnessed some of these hunger strikes. He said that this form of protest made the most sense because, quote, our hunger strike didn't really start 23 days ago. It started back in 2020. I've been hungry for over a year. A lot of these workers were also evicted, even though there were eviction moratoriums in New York. They were the first to be let out of their homes. And a lot of them were threatened with ICE calls because they were undocumented, because yes, they were renting this apartment, but they didn't really have a right to be there anymore if they couldn't pay. And so one of the big things that comes out, and I'll end with this, was that undocumented workers realized that a very big part of their identity as it was perceived by the US and their human worth had a lot to do with what they were able to work day in and day out. And when they lost that capacity to work, it just felt like they had nowhere else to go. And so here are some more photos of the Excluded Workers Coalition and kind of this historic, here we have our three longest standing strikers. Here we have a little drawing that Rubiela Correa did. And then if we could move up a couple of slides, here we have so many photos. Okay. And so we have kind of in 9/11, we have this moment in which things go back to normal and the undocumented become this footnote in the history of 9/11. We don't really associate these people with official histories of 9/11. And so something very similar happens right now, which is delivery apps trying to find new ways to not pay these workers what they said they would pay them. And so before, apps would allow customers to tip before they checked out. Now they've moved that to kind of the last part of the order. And then if you actually want to tip a worker, they complete your order and then you have to find a little button. No one is going to go back to their phone after they get their food and just kind of are able to tip that way. If we could do the next slide. And then with undocumented workers who were recognized as essential workers and were given this money as a retroactive pandemic payment, there were a lot of calls for, can we make this permanent? Can we give people some sort of safety net? If these people are working in and day out, can we include them in unemployment despite their immigration status? And that's also a fight that has certainly been lost over and over in 2022 and 2023. And so I'll end by saying that the undocumented are still doing the very same jobs that they were doing in the early 2000s. And their work continues to be essential, but also invisible. And one of the big reasons why we keep having these discussions of why migration just doesn't end, how to keep people out or how to sanction their entries, which is kind of the two sides of the debate, we don't really talk about why so many people keep coming here, which is to work. And I would kind of invite us to think about what would happen to the apps in New York City if these people weren't around. Would they work at all? Would we get our food? Thank you.
And again, we welcome your questions. Julia. Yeah.
Hi there. I'm Julia Young. I'm a historian at Catholic University on the other side of the city. And I loved your presentation. Thank you. I wonder if you could, and I especially loved it because one of the things I try to talk to my students about is the both stay out and come in, like contradiction of our entire migration system. So so if you can get past the wall, we'll hire you, but otherwise stay out. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about those employers. Well, two things. I mean, one, if you could talk about their strategies to, I assume, lobby against laws like this being passed and maintain the status quo. Like who is DoorDash? Does DoorDash have a lobbying wing now in DC? Okay, I figured. But and then have you found out more in your research about the process by which they get the social security numbers, the IDs, like who's profiting from that? Is that its own shadow industry? I'd love to know more about that. I've always been curious and I don't know that much. So thank you.
To be perfectly honest, it's something that I'm working through right now. I'm like, where do they get these papers? And you have kind of a story in the 1980s and the 1990s in which E-Verify is just not a thing. And these papers are just physically there and they get them. And there's a lot of kind of weird esoteric New York Times reporting that says like for $50 you can get like a whole new identity if you're an undocumented worker to just work. And you have a different story now, which like a lot of people go like, no, you can't work without a social security number that matches something in the database. But then the IRS and Social Security Administration still have these like dockets of contributions that are made to the US fiscal system that are coming in through mismatched or unexisting social security numbers. So kind of raises questions about what E-Verify even does. And so we have a lot of discussions about kind of airports and a lot of policing of immigrants' identities, but we have those discussions kind of in relation to, are they going to be deported or are they going to be detained in an airport, for example, if they don't have a valid license? But we think less about the social security numbers that are going into these allegedly kind of verification processes. And with delivery apps, it's like a fully technological process that is getting, you know, those social security numbers through the system. I've asked a lot of workers this, and no, you know, understandably so, they're very reticent to share how, and they're like, don't ask me about it, don't worry about it. So it's something that I'm trying to work through. And when it comes to lobbying, so in California, which is kind of the anti-New York case, also a largely undocumented workforce, also a largely immigrant workforce, DoorDash poured over, I think it was over $8 billion, and then Uber Eats kind of pitched in as well, just to preserve the independent contractor status. And so if you look at the records of these companies, because they're public companies, they list kind of the biggest threats to their economic models. And one of those threats is to lose the independent contractor status. And so less Americans are taking that status, even though, it's very prevalent now with Amazon, with just different industries that are making gig workers just kind of the normal worker. But when it comes to DoorDash and to Uber Eats, they're very much on top of preserving that status. And they do these like crafty little things, and they lobby very aggressively. And they are doing that in New York right now, but also in DC, of saying we need cheap workers. And the ultimate cheap workers are undocumented immigrants, but that's not kind of the conversation, right? It's all kind of a little bit under the table.
Hi, thank you, Ratna. That's what's fascinating. I have a question more generally about migrants. Some people migrate fleeing violence. Some people migrate finding economic opportunities. So if there's a sense of what percentage is migrating for what reason, and then the role of those that are migrating for economic opportunities, the role that temporary work visas could have as a solution to the problem of illegal migration.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's an amazing book. I'm blanking on the author right now, but it's called Human Capital. And it's kind of this discussion of, we don't only have undocumented immigrants who are being funneled into these industries. We have asylum seekers who do get some form of temporary work permits, and we have a mix of reasons of why people are migrating. I think what's interesting to me is, regardless of whether you're migrating because you're fleeing from violence, because you're fleeing from prosecution, or because you're fleeing from also kind of economic deserts in Latin America, you still need to sustain yourself at one point when you're in the US. And you have a lot of asylum seekers who are working as undocumented workers because their temporary permits are not coming in, or they're taking too long. So when it comes to kind of the temporary work authorization, it's a conversation that we keep having. It's kind of like, if we could only do another Bracero program, if we could expand the H-2B program, if we could just give them kind of these temporary ways of working, and then you have corporate lobbies that are very much against that kind of legislation, and it makes you think, why? And the answer is pretty obvious. It's a lot more profitable to kind of have this kind of gray area in which temporary work permits are not part of the conversation. And we don't really care about making these workers, quote, legal. We kind of want them as they are. And we kind of want those fears of deportation and detention to be with them when they're working. I certainly think work authorization reform is something to talk about. And I do think there are some solutions there. But it's really intriguing that whenever we start talking about it, there's still kind of this rhetoric of, if we give these migrants temporary work permits, which is ultimately what a lot of people want, they're going to abuse them, and they're going to stay here, and they're just going to have expired temporary work permits. And then all the conversations that we have about visas are for highly skilled immigrants. That's kind of the conversation, right? And so we don't really think about what kind of low wage workers, how they fare into these conversations about just allowing more people to come in and work. So I think there's a reason why that's not kind of the conversation that we're having. And I do think it could help, but I think it could also very quickly become another weapon to keep these workers employed in kind of these liminal statuses.
Thank you. Today we've had two presentations that give me the impression that there is a second reality to whatever is happening between Mexico and the US. So we have, for instance, this thing about the Mexico becoming a buffer state is only a recent debate in Mexico, while you are telling us that this has been the case for 25 years already. You're talking about ghost workers who keep on to me, it's not so much the apps that are ghost, but the workers who are ghosts. And so I wonder if there's any institution that is linked to these two problems. What makes it last? Why is this flow continuous? Why doesn't it stop? Is there an institution that keeps it going? And I would ask the same about this, the immigration from Central America. Is there an institution? Maybe the flow of Central Americans has already created an institution. Has it? Institution is like rules.
There are organizations that help Central Americans cross through Mexico. Churches provide a lot of help. And then there's people, for example, in certain towns that throw tortillas as the train goes by. So is that the sort of institutions that you're talking about? They're more in, the churches are formal. The throwing tortillas and stuff is more informal.
And I'll add to that there's also a lot of silences when it comes to the formal institutions and kind of how they think about immigration, how we talk about immigration, what the problem is. And so employers, for example, thinking about big corporations, you're thinking about the people who supply that labor. So contractors, for example, they're very much counting in, what Anna was mentioning, these people kind of getting here through informal channels, getting through Mexico, getting into the US, and to hire them. So it's a very cynical answer in a lot of ways, but there are silences when it comes to the formal policing of migrants. And there's also enough people coming in today that you have enough bodies to deport, you have enough bodies to detain, and you still have enough bodies to work, which is, kind of a very, again, cynical answer, but there's enough for this system of restriction to keep existing and to keep feeding it. And then at the same time, you still get to profit off of their work at the same time.
Hello. I haven't yet spoken yet. Really great presentations. I'll also say there is, this is a process migrating northward for, yes, it's newer for Central Americans, right? Since the 1980s in large part, late 70s. But this has been going on now for over a century with respect to Mexico, if not longer. And so you have institutionally these social ties that are no longer just Martha and I know each other, we're sisters, but it's can be for many people, not everyone, very extensive ties. So, I'm from Puebla or some little town outside of Puebla, and I have, my people I know are in New York. And even though my brother returned, or God forbid, my mother passed away, right? I still have this this network that really can help in times when I need it to help me, right? Lower the costs and lower the costs of my moving. So that has become institutionalized. We often think of networks as individual ties, but they're also now, they've accumulated up such that it's an institutional support that we sometimes miss because we're focused on economic drivers or political drivers. We have to remember these are people with long histories of relying on movement.
And I'm going to jump in on this conversation as the historian of the long term here. First thing I'm going to say is the northward flow from what was originally Mesoamerica actually goes back to the 16th century. It's the border that moved south that turned it into transnational migration. But the flow has been ongoing for a long time. So perhaps we should keep that in mind. But I also want to share a particular story you're going to start hearing. I learn a lot from my graduate students. I count on that. continuing to. Back in the 90s, and somebody else is going to remember, perhaps Anna, there was the proposition that Pete Wilson, the governor of California, pushed for his own political purposes to radically constrain immigrant rights, mostly then Mexican, in California. It was a widely debated, discussed thing. And he, of course, won, rode to victory on it, and then had it all over, almost all overturned in the courts, so that California didn't have to actually live with the restrictions he won election on. That is sort of inevitable. That's been ongoing. What I learned from a wonderful doctoral student, who I won't name at the moment, she happened to be working a side gig, working in the Washington lobbying office for La Raza at the time. And La Raza is, of course, actively lobbying against these restrictions, while the political world in California, and apparently much of the California, how economic power is. She came by one day and she said to me, you know who I just found out is funding La Raza's movement to contain these restrictions without absolutely below the radar, silently? The US Chamber of Commerce. Because the US Chamber of Commerce needed the workers to keep coming. And the perfect solution is for the workers to keep coming, but to face continuing solutions. My cynicism says that is the institutional goal. We need them here, we will malign them. And if they both keep coming and are constrained and maligned, they are serving the US macroeconomy how they're supposed to, and it's going to keep happening.
I've got it. I'm also a historian of the long term. I have a friend working on the history of the field of feminist economics, and I feel like that field would be so interested in what's going on here. And it's an inchoate question about the gender dynamics of what you're sort of chronicling here, because in one way, this is a really seismic moment in terms of consumption about people's household, what would be seen as domestic reproductive labor inside the household of cooking meals, and the outsourcing of that and making it waged labor outside of the household. And so part of me is curious just about even the foodways of the people who are doing this delivery, how their consumption is shaped by their work, if it is at all. But I think of, I don't know if we saw the women at the end, but you mentioned it's a mostly male workforce, and I'm wondering if these are supporting families, and if on the other side of these organization efforts, there's unwaged domestic workers who don't have access to that kind of organizing isn't happening. I guess I'm just curious there's so many things on the other side of these workers that I'm curious about their consumption, the gender dynamics, but all the kind of linking production and consumption here, because what's also happening is it's just a huge shift in the last 5 years in the United States.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's also something that I've been really intrigued by. Because so a lot of delivery workers, they do still fit that profile of kind of a largely male group, a lot of them still not coming in with their wives, or a lot of them still kind of sustaining communities abroad. So you do have kind of that bachelor immigrant society. But you have also more and more couples in which the man is a deliverista and then the woman is a house cleaner. So it's not necessarily that women are they're doing this kind of domestic labor in these immigrant households, but it's also a lot of single men sending money abroad. And it's also couples that are both kind of working. So you also have more and more women deliveristas, which is an interesting kind of development there too. But when it comes to kind of and I kind of mentioned this in the first part of the talk, and I kind of was rushing a little bit at the end, so I didn't really get to talk more about the women who were pretty much orchestrating the Excluded Workers Coalition and the hunger strike. So these were mainly women who were striking, and it was mainly women in the food service sector, and mainly women who were doing also domestic work and childcare. And so A lot of these women came in also as single mothers. A lot of them were kind of now the primary wage earner for transnational families, even though they were women. And so, there's people who've written a lot about this, kind of the feminization of immigration and the expectation that primary wage earners are only men is just, kind of not really true anymore. But at the same time, you do have a lot of women doing kind of these domestic tasks in the homes of working professionals, a lot of them white in New York City. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but you have more women working alongside men, and you also have workforces that are still very gendered. So you have the domestic workers, who a lot of them are day laborers. So that's something we tend to associate a lot more with men, but we have now kind of domestic workers who are day laborers in New York, and they're largely women. And then you have another version of day labor, which are the periodistas, who are still largely men. But I think there's just a lot going on there. I don't know exactly kind of where the trend is going to go, but you do have gender roles that are changing, and you have gender roles that are being kind of solidified in other ways. So it's an interesting.
Thank you. I need to thank you all so you can hear me. And we need to take another 5 minutes. Refreshments are arriving. And we got one more session to go, and we will carry on. So thank you all. Thank you, Martha. Okay. All right. I want to welcome all back. And we have our third session. And it is an equally great pleasure to welcome my colleague, Catherine Donato, who holds the Hertzberg Professorship of International Migration at Georgetown. We're a little short on time, so I'm just going to say you can look at the program with a little bit of the many things, but she has over the years written important work on migration in the Americas and into the United States, but also important work on migration in South Asia. So she really brings us a global comparative perspective here. And I am just going to say one of the reasons I was happiest to recruit her here, and I think she'll appreciate this, Catherine and I have interacted too often most recently about some endless challenges of faculty governance in the School of Foreign Service. And it is such a pleasure to welcome her as the scholar and analyst that she is, and to bring that to the public forum at Georgetown.
Well, thank you,
Kath.
John. Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation for all of what John just said, but especially because this is kind of how I started studying Mexico-US migration over the course of 20 years. I still write a lot about the Americas. I teach a graduate course on migration in the Americas. So I've learned a lot today, and I'm going to try to be fast. We're losing the audience, number one, and we need to get finished with this to move on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize at a pretty high level of aggregation the situations and policies faced by people on the move in Mexico and the United States. I'm going to emphasize what's new. I'm going to differentiate among the different types of people on the move, which is a big challenge today. And then I'm going to identify, broadly speaking, challenges and potential solutions. Go to the next slide. So I'm going to start with Mexico. The first half of my slides are Mexico. Let's just start here by saying after about 2006, Mexico migration to the United States shifts away. Mexico itself as a country shifts away from a country sending migrants largely to the US to a mixed context where transit, return, and new migration is happening. Mexico plays a much larger role than in the past in migration management in the Americas. Anna's point well taken, but still each year I'm shocked by, as was pointed out, you know, Blinken goes down to Mexico and all of a sudden the next day there's a change that's announced with no details about what that change is really, how that change happened. But Mexico, like the United States, really has responded with few federal initiatives to deal with the mixed flows. And that's part of why I think both countries are not realizing the potential of migration for both of these countries because they don't have policies in place, nor it seems to me, do they care to have the policies in place. So next slide. Shifts in the type of movement that Mexico is seeing between, you know, in the last 20 years or so, the Mexican foreign-born population, it still is fairly small relative to the total population in Mexico. But as you can see, it's grown by 100%. It's more than doubled in that 20-year period. And I imagine between 2020 and 2030, we're going to see probably another growth at this rate or higher. It's a fairly gender balanced population, but the population is very young. And this has really important implications for any country, no less Mexico. 60% are less than 20 years old. And that reflects the return of Mexican parents and their US-born children. Estimates suggest now there are over 600,000 US-born children now living in Mexico, having returned with their parents. Now, let me just caveat by saying data on migration are always a challenge, Data in this context is even more challenging for all kinds of reasons. We can, if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer. Go to the next slide. So one of the things we see in Mexico is this huge rise in asylum applications. If you just trace between the first bar 2015 up until 2022, which is the next to last bar on the left-hand side, you can see quite a huge rise from essentially almost no asylum applications to certainly more than 100,000. And I just didn't have the time to update that last bar, 2023, on the left-hand figure, but it was about another 128,000 by the end of FY23. So we're talking about just rising numbers and big numbers that a country like Mexico has never really had to manage or understand before. In 2022, you can see Haitians and Hondurans led the asylum seekers. This shifts around a bit year by year, but Haitians in the last few years have led and Hondurans have led as well. Next slide. In addition, we can get some sense, again, this is data that we have that we could question, but we see an upward shift in the number of permanent resident cards that are being issued in Mexico, suggesting there are at least some people now that are staying, more people entering and staying, and humanitarian visas have grown in the last few years. And those often are the temporary visas that people get while they're seeking, right, permanent residency, and they're seeking asylum or protection from being deported. Next slide. And then, you know, we could say, okay, so what does Mexico do in terms of admitting people and regulating the regular migrant population, meaning those who come in with some kind of legal status? There is a law, a 2011 Migration Act. It actually, at the time, I wrote about this, was a big deal compared to the US because it recognizes the human rights of migrants. I mean, just the fact that there was a migration law that was within reach of the United States, a country emphasizing human rights, was a flashpoint for many of us in the US. And it's a law that's established around two main types of migrants: people who come in with a permanent visa or temporary in a temporary status. But the but here is that a lot of this law is written for people who have socioeconomic resources of some type or another, or a tie to family, because the law does recognize the right to family reunification. Before this 2011 law, there was no migration law in Mexico. So this was a moment, yet despite this progress, as some people were writing about it at that time, migrants could be prevented from full integration into Mexican society. The law really didn't capture or allocate any resources, neither does the US law, to facilitate integration should people need support to do that. So therefore, for example, if there's discrimination, there might be platitudes, but there's no real way, if you're an immigrant in Mexico and you experience discrimination, let's say on the job, you don't really have any leverage then to file a complaint that has meaning. This, by the way, is very important for the Mexican migrants who are returning to Mexico in the last 10 to 15 years. And we see that their life reintegrating is also quite difficult. And they're typically without government or, you know, any kind of resource to deal with the kind of discrimination that they face. In 2011, there was also the Refugees Complementary Protection and Political Asylum Act, which offered protection to those fearing persecution if returned on the basis of much more than the US law, equivalent law has. So on the basis of religion, nationality, race, gender, as well as violence, internal conflict, and human rights violations. Again, on paper, this appears to be, and on paper it is, an expanded definition for protection for people, for example, who fear for their lives if they return, compared to the US. And it's similar to the 1984 Cartagena Declaration on Refugees as well. Now, COMAR, which is the acronym for the government agency, the Mexican government agency who is in charge of the refugee process, is, as you can imagine from one of the first figures I showed you, where applications for asylum is going way up. COMAR is very busy these days, much busier than 10 years ago. But COMAR is woefully underfunded. And so what does that mean? That means many people are traveling in and within, and they're not filing for anything, frankly, and they're not being picked up by the Mexican system that in theory might be able to assist them. UNHCR Mexico, as Jackie Lamas and myself and several other colleagues, we worked on a project in Mexico. In UNHCR Mexico is doing relocating refugees that come in at the southern border of Mexico into cities throughout Mexico and facilitates their early integration. So UNHCR Mexico is trying to assist. Oh, sorry. We also have, there were several people on this project here. They assist COMAR with resources, but again, woefully underfunded. And then there are restrictions. If in fact I apply for asylum when I cross over from Guatemala into Mexico, I have to stay in that area until the end of the application process, which many people find to be a burden in different ways, in part because often families are separated and they're coming in different ways. And then you find out, let's say your parents are in Mexico City, but you have only crossed over now and you're filing, but you have to stay there. Next slide. And then we have, Mexico's irregular migration, the transit of irregular migrants. And what's going on in this space is that Mexico, as both of the speakers pointed out earlier, is that there are more resources for raids, for searching, for irregular migrants, more detention, there's more deportation. All of the enforcement first mechanisms that are being used in the United States are now regularly employed in Mexico. Intercepting them on buses, on trains. The Mexican government increasingly relies on the National Guard to help sort of supplement their people on the ground. But often, it's difficult to identify yourself. If you come in, for example, you cross over from Guatemala into southern Mexico and you don't have ID documents, and part of the reason why you don't have those documents is because you didn't have the money, the time, or the ability to actually get them from the Honduran government. And so here you are in Mexico now, and so you're not going to go to, most of the time, to COMAR, because it doesn't have a lot of resources. The line outside that office in southern Mexico is always long, all day long. So you're kind of stuck. You're stuck in this irregular status that few institutions, organizations can help you out of. There's one exception for unaccompanied minors. There was some legislative reforms for the unaccompanied minors in 2020, so that they, without IDs, that they're given the identification number, the CORP, which is the identification number that everybody who lives in Mexico has, and it allows you, It enables you to access services. Without that, you can't. So for unaccompanied kids, there is now an exception. Next slide. All right, let's just kind of quickly review at a high level the United States. Of course, there's a lot more to say on all these slides. So, but we'll talk about growing numbers, seeking entry at the southern border, greater diversity in the national origins of people coming in at the border. And then again, US policies are piecemeal and increasingly relying on Mexico, although again, we don't understand exactly what deals are being cut. Here I am in, like John, a school of foreign service where the diplomats are doing all this negotiating. And I always say to my colleagues, like, can't you tell me something? Do you know anything? They don't know anything. They don't know the specifics, right? They can imagine the kinds of deals that are cut. Okay, so rising numbers, you can see we start here in 2013, we go up to year to date in 2024, but the full fiscal year of 23 is there, so you can compare from 2013 to 2023. And then the colors of the bars refer to single adults in green, people coming in as part of a family unit in yellow, and then the unaccompanied children in red. So you can see that certainly the numbers of people being apprehended at the border have increased a lot. A lot of this is very specifically tied to COVID, the way COVID was managed. We'll talk about Title 42 in a minute, but other right before COVID, other policies that essentially kept people in Mexico and then built up demand to cross. And so people started doing, which is something that back in the day when I started studying Mexico-US migration, occurred, which was at that time in the early 90s, people just tried. And if they were apprehended, they'd go back and try again. So that try, and try again mentality or behavior, COVID kind of pushed that behavior back in to what's going on at the border. The numbers go way up. Remember that, just a note, the number of apprehensions does not correspond to the numbers of people, because people can be apprehended more than once. And the US government does not offer to us, of course, they have the data, but they don't offer to us the possibility of talking about people. In this case, we can only talk about numbers of times some people have been apprehended. Okay, so the next slide, you can see the shift. Yeah, you can see the national origin shift here. Again, that the absolute numbers are the same at the top of the bars, but now we're looking at, Mexico is at the bottom of most of these bars, Mexican born, and then Hondurans, recently in gray, Guatemalans, right, representing a large share of the apprehensions at the border. And then the blue on top of it is Salvador. And you can see the share of apprehensions from El Salvador was actually larger in earlier years when the absolute number wasn't as high. And then what I find interesting, and more of us are talking about, is that lighter blue at the very top. And those are other national origins. Those are the Chinese, those are the Ukrainians, those are the Russians, those are the Ecuadorians, they're the Cubans, they're the Nicaraguans, okay? They are all there, and you can see that light blue is small, but it appears to be growing as a share of all apprehensions. Okay, next slide. So the US is increasingly relying on Mexico. The US, as was pointed out earlier, is externalizing their border enforcement practices to Mexico, and I would argue further south, Panama. Costa Rica appears to be distancing itself from the US to a certain extent, but certainly Panama is very involved. Before Title 42, which is the last bullet, which was put in place right after COVID began, which prevented the entry of asylum seekers during the pandemic. They were considered non-essential travelers across the border. That ended, as you can see, May 23. But before that, during the Trump administration, the Migrant Protection Protocols, which is a name which is ironic, began 2019, about a year long. And it also forced asylum seekers to wait in Mexico until their court date. And literally people had a piece of paper with the court date, and they were told to show up at the bridge in El Paso at 4:30 in the morning, months and months away from the day that they received that date. So they're living in Mexico, again, under conditions that are very rough, unsafe, and extremely difficult, right? Because Mexico isn't recognizing that they're there, they're unable to work with any regular status, etc. Okay, so the U.S. increasingly relying on Mexico. No one has mentioned this, or at least there's one slide that for which there's something brand new, which is the latest example, right, of the U.S. relying on Mexico and Mexico's voice. When I saw that New York Times piece, and I was just like, wow, and yeah, and what a world we live in, right? But there is currently a humanitarian parole program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. And that program started a little bit over a year ago, about a year, actually about almost 2 years ago for Venezuelans, but it was extended about a year and a half ago for everyone. Okay, one of the amazing things, attributes of this program is that it was designed to try to stop people from transiting through because of all the risks. So what can we do? Well, we can set up a parole program so that if you're in Haiti and I'm your relative and I live in Miami, that you can apply to come to the US for a 2-year humanitarian temporary visa. You immediately have work authorization and you fly into the US, right? Rather than put you at risk, yourself at risk and everyone else at risk to transit through. A good idea. On the flip side, the US negotiates with Mexico to say the US will accept up to 30,000 applicants for parole from these 4 countries. But in exchange, Mexico permits the US to expel up to 30,000 people from these countries back to Mexico. This is really important. These are 4 countries to which the US cannot easily deport people. They can't easily send flights to Haiti, given what's going on in Haiti now. Cuba is really reluctant, although in the last few months, they've accepted some flights of people back. So the US needed a place to deport people from these national origins. And so Mexico has agreed to accept up to 30,000. Again, how many they've received, it's not clear. Next slide. Regular entry, it should say, not NT. Okay, so let's talk about the US system for regulating regular entry, meaning authorized entry. Well, one of the things you must know right away is that, number one, the visa system, in order to change it in the United States, it requires legislative reform, which means we have to have Congress to work together. And we're not getting a lot of that these days. What has been happening since President G.W. Bush is that presidents have used executive actions to get things done around the edges. So, and there's all kinds of examples of that.
So to fill in the blanks, not to change the system, but to fill in the blanks, all presidents, including President Trump, but believe me, he is not the only one, they've relied on these executive actions. So there's been little to no change in the visa system since the passage of the 1990 Immigration Act. If you talk to any private sector employer and you say, when was the last time you changed your hiring practices? They'll go and tell you last month, last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It's now been over 30 years and we haven't changed the visa system that permits people to enter. Has our economy changed? Yes. Have people who want to come into the US, have those flows changed? Yes. But we are stuck. We have now, as a result, these very long visa queues by country. Wait time rises every single year. So if you have a relative who has filed to come in as a relative, as whatever relative in the visa system, that person can be waiting 15 years. That's the average across all national origins. So when people say they should come in, right? They should come in the legal way, the way I did it. Well, the way odds are that person did it was decades ago when there weren't these wait, these visa queues. The old system also has a lot of unintended impacts, including incentivizing behavior that often involves fraudulent activity, whether that's through marrying a US citizen or other things I don't even really like to talk about too much, but it's certainly, these are incentivized by a system that essentially is 100% broken. Then you have for international protection, people who are seeking asylum or refugees, we have the 1980 Refugee Act. It too has not been changed. That act really, I've read both of these laws. This act, next slide, sorry. I'm looking at it here, but not here. This act, it really was designed with a vision of small numbers of people seeking protection. President Carter signed this into action. He wanted to find refuge for many of the people who came out of the Vietnam and related wars in Southeast Asia. But here too, there hasn't been any reform. Since 2017, however, the US government has been seeking ways to limit asylum seeking at the border. And that's why you see Title 42, or you see the MPP program that I mentioned. There are a variety of other ones that some legal scholars say the US government is not only trying to limit asylum seeking, the US government is trying to end it. Large numbers of asylum seekers at the border now, in the past few years, really have created long backlogs in immigration courts, which have had, as a result, a whole nother set of unintended kind of perverse consequences, incentivizing some judges to adjudicate quickly, which often means negatively. And there is very high demand right now for immigration lawyers. Should any of you want to change your profession, but there's very limited supply. So you have all the migrants being bused in the past to New York, to Washington, D.C. I mean, I personally called on behalf of a migrant family a Venezuelan family who showed up here, and 15 legal offices, some of which I had some connection to, absolutely no one for the next 4 months when I called could represent this person. If you don't have representation, you're not going to get asylum. Those numbers are clear and have been established. Next slide. And then we have the irregular migration. This now is a smaller, it's still a large population, but it's smaller than it used to be. And it's more diverse. So you can see the decline there. And Mexican-born Unauthorized population has also declined. There are many reasons for that we could talk about. But the key thing about this slide is the last bullet point, because given all of the perverse consequences of having a system the way we have it, it's just become much more complex. With presidential executive actions, no legislative reform, now we have all sorts of people who are unauthorized, people who come in authorized, who overstay their visas, people, and that's the largest right now group, but also people who have deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA recipients, their status, it's not a legal status. Technically, most people who count unauthorized persons include the DACA recipients in the unauthorized group. People who have TPS, temporary protective status, same thing. So we now have created such complexity in the system. I mean, who would have thought 20 years ago, if I had any money and somebody would have said, this is a system we would have 20 years from now, I would have lost all my money. Okay. So we're in a very strange moment. We have these two countries which have done in the past, maybe going back now. I know I'm nervous always to say that with historians in the room. But we have two countries that now are sharing some key challenges. And both countries, increasing numbers of people arriving and settling, both countries without a federally coordinated response. And as a result, all sorts of things are happening. We're certainly, the larger we, Mexico and the United States, we are certainly not taking advantage of the potential that migration offers to countries. This allows the lack of a coordinated federal approach, allows local responses, which can range from being very welcoming to being very restrictive, to take hold. And such, the example of the governors of Arizona and Texas and Florida sending people on buses up to the democratic cities where, we can take care of them, and overrunning, right, those cities is a good illustration. There are all kinds of local responses. I don't mean to say that they're only anti-immigrant or restrictive responses, but the fact that we have so much variation now in how we locally respond, that's a problem. And all of this spurs tensions and feeds a level of discontent, and feeds a narrative about migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in the United States, which is typically completely wrong, that narrative. And yet here we are persisting. So what can be done? The last slide, I believe. I mean, there's a lot to say here. I just put it all on there. We need to prioritize legislative reforms. We really need to have a coordinated regional approach. The United States, Mexico, maybe Canada will invite in, maybe the Americas further south, but we really need to think about a coordinated approach that has, humane outcomes at the end of the day. Develop legal pathways. This is being said now for the last couple of years. That's fine, except that our visa system needs so much change in order to develop more legal pathways, because the system has a certain set number of visas, and we can't change that without Congress making change. Facilitating movement out of the temporary status into permanent status. Why do we still have 600,000 people with DACA status? It's because we have been unable to facilitate their shifting into a permanent residency status. There's no political will. That's really what the problem is. Let me say, there's nothing that I'm saying that is rocket science. It doesn't need 20 years of research and development to figure out the solutions. The solutions are there. We have to be willing to not use immigration for other political means, and to just to really reform a system that's barely in need of it. One of the develop a flexible. That's just seems like a radical word for the immigration system. A flexible and strategic relocation system. If it is true that lots of people are showing up in Del Rio, Texas, right? Too many. What, 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, there were 15,000 Haitians that showed up in Del Rio. That's the way it was presented to us in the media. It's not the way Mexico and the United States, they knew 15,000 people were coming up to the border. They knew that. But that's the narrative, 15,000 people. But should that happen, why can't we develop a system at the border that enables moving people when needed? And obviously doing that in a humane way. And then developing a funding stream. I've been saying this 20 years ago to assist localities in integration. We don't, nor does Mexico, have really any policy about integration with the exception of refugee resettlement. We give refugees who formally resettle in the United States a little bit of subsidies. After 2 months, they're almost all gone. But develop a funding stream. And one way we can do this is to use the unclaimed benefits from undocumented migrants receiving Social Security covered wages. There's a fabulous report on this from Brookings in 2010. And this is almost a talking point in almost every single, no one's listening, but there's a lot of money there. And instead right now that money goes into, it just stays in the Social Security system. But you could imagine we could do something creative there and maybe take a proportion of that, of those unclaimed benefits and help fund what's going on the ground locally. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And again, we will open the floor to questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Donato. Hi, everyone. My name is Jackie. I guess my question is for you, Professor Donato, and then also if the other panelists think of something, would also welcome your thoughts. But today, a lot of different terms have been thrown out to describe the irregular, unauthorized, undocumented population. And so my question is, what would you deem the most appropriate way to categorize this group of people? Because context, I work for the Census Bureau and I'm in the International Migration Branch, and those are discussions we're having right now. So I'd really love to hear your perspective. So yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, and the problem is that some of these terms become politicized and then depoliticized and they shift, right? So when, 2016, actually before the Trump presidency, even, during Obama's presidency, I would give talks, more public talks on migration, and I would say undocumented, and then there'd be somebody in the audience who was saying, how can you say they're undocumented? Because that term had become politicized. So my strategy, so I use all these terms all the time. So you saw undocumented there, but I also say unauthorized. And I am trying my sort of an unstated goal, right, is to depoliticize all these terms. They describe a certain kind of person who, is either entering the US in a particular way, living in the US, transiting through Mexico, seeking something, employment, seeking protection. And I'm trying to use the terms, the Census Bureau won't like that answer because, but I understand why the Census Bureau is concerned about those terms, right? And I'm concerned too, but I really am trying to just use them evenly.
The one, I agree, the one that I really don't use ever is illegal.
Yeah, agreed there.
We can, like, I steal a bottle of water, it doesn't make me an illegal person. Crossing the border is a misdemeanor. And yet it converts people into illegal. So that's the one term that I would avoid. Well, I'm not, that's one term that I would definitely avoid. I also use undocumented and unauthorized.
Yeah, I usually start with the undergrads and I say, in the very beginning of classes on immigration, migration, I say, who has ever done anything illegal? And then I say, I don't want any details. Just raise your hand. And almost the whole class raises their hand because they're thinking about parking tickets. Something simple. They're also probably thinking about some other things I don't want to think about. So yeah, I don't use illegal.
And I'll also say that I struggled with undocumented when I first started using it. And I involved in conversations in which people said saying something like undocumented worker is, you're othering, it's ableist because, these people are only workers to you, which I think those were all valid concerns. But then talking also to people who are in this country without authorization, and as you were saying, kind of the vast array of what that looks like. A lot of kind of the language really does hinge on papers, and like the papers are such a big thing, and no tener papeles is such a kind of a common expression among migrants. So it's also something that I think, and the Liberistas, like all of these words are also words that these communities are using. So I think undocumented is a word that I've heard a lot kind of in these circles and felt more comfortable using over time.
All pretty tired, probably.
Well, and we actually, because there are refreshments, there's wine, there are books to purchase, and I don't want to sound honored at a particular time. So what I want to say is go buy a book, please, and take it down and interrupt her in conversation. It's so exciting.